Hey gang, Christopher here with Fujifilm with another From the Workbench video. In this episode we're going to cover Auto ISO and how to set it up on your camera. Now the placement might be different depending on the age and model of your camera, but the premise is still the same. So you might find it under a physical dial, through the quick menu, through a function button, and finally through the regular menu itself, and that's where we're going to be starting today. So it's menu, camera icon, and finally ISO. And we're going to go all the way down to the bottom, and you should see either one or three different Auto ISO settings. So let's click what's available. So you should see default sensitivity, which is the lowest ISO you want your camera to use. Max sensitivity, which is the opposite, the maximum setting you want your camera to use. And finally, the minimum shutter speed. This is going to be the shutter speed you don't want your camera to drop below. Let's talk about how I set up Auto ISO on my camera. So for Auto ISO 1, my default sensitivity is going to be the lowest ISO possible on my camera, so either 160 or 200. The max sensitivity is going to be the highest ISO available on my camera, so 6400 or 12800. And finally, the minimum shutter speed for Auto ISO 1 is going to be 1/60th of a second. This is going to be the minimum shutter speed that I can physically hand hold. Next, for Auto ISO 2, I have the same min and max ISO, but I changed the minimum shutter speed to 1/320th of a second. This is for faster moving subjects. Next, for the final Auto ISO 3, I set the min and the max ISO exactly as before, but I keep the minimum shutter speed on default. This is going to function one of two ways. Either A, if you're in program or aperture priority, it's going to pull the lens information from the body of the camera and apply that towards your shutter speed. So the longer the focal length you have, the higher the shutter speed that it's going to use as its minimum. Or, if you're choosing manual mode, this allows you to finally use exposure compensation when you're shooting, and this is what I like to do normally. So finally, for easy access, I set up one of my function buttons to Auto ISO setting. This allows me to choose one of the three individual Auto ISOs that I've made without having to go through the menu again. So this is a great way to change your Auto ISO range depending on what scene you're shooting. So if you're hand holding, I can choose Auto ISO setting 1 by 1/60th of a second. If I'm moving to faster moving subjects, I can change my Auto ISO to Auto ISO 2. So now it's not going to drop below 1/320th of a second. And finally, Auto ISO 3, I can choose whenever I want to when I'm shooting manual mode. It's just a great way to get to these settings very quickly. Well, that's it for this episode of From the Workbench of Fujifilm. I hope you found these tips helpful. We'll see you next week.